Troy's lecture this evening marks the opening of an exhibition in the exhibition gallery across the hall. The exhibition was funded by several sources, and I thought I would like to take this opportunity to mention them to you. Support for the exhibition came from the Indiana Architectural Foundation, the College of Architecture and Planning at Ball State, and the Ball State University Office of Research and Sponsored Programs. We have several guests tonight from those sponsoring organizations, and I would like to introduce them briefly and thank them for their support for the exhibition and the associated activities. From the Indiana Architectural Foundation, Rusty Wilhite is with us tonight, president of the Indiana Architectural Foundation. Would you guys like to stand and be recognized? Wayne Schmidt, past vice president of the Indiana Architectural Foundation. And Lynn Molzen, member of the board of directors of the Indiana Architectural Foundation. Did I leave anybody out? Did you bring anybody else with you? From the College of Architecture and Planning, a guest, I suppose, Robert Fisher, Dean of the College. And Jeffrey Hall, Associate Dean of the College. From the Office of Research and Sponsored Programs, Jim Pyle, Director. We are also honored to have with us this evening Crawford Greenwalt, Field Director of the Sardis Expedition and Professor of Classics at the University of California at Berkeley. Greenie. And also Troy's parents, Mr. and Mrs. John Thompson. The main force behind the exhibit, however, was our speaker, Troy Thompson. The exhibit was his idea. He conceived it. He raised the funds for it. He selected the images from over thousands in the files of the Sardis Expedition Office. He designed the panels, and he saw it through to completion. He even slept through a structures quiz because of it, and probably missed some other things on the way as well that I don't know about. A native of Coatesville, Indiana, Troy is a Ball State University student, a dual major, majoring in architecture and philosophy, which is quite important to him and also connected with his motivations for going to Sardis. He is a past vice president and past president of the Architecture Students Organization, the AIAS, past editor-in-chief of the student publication Capsule. He's worked for 2 summers for the Historic American Building Survey out of Washington, D.C. He spent those 2 summers first in Maryland, documenting the Maryland State Capitol, and then in Death Valley, California, documenting a place called Scotty's Castle in Death Valley. Professionally, in another context, a more usual context, he's worked for Schmidt Associates in Indianapolis and for Gooden Associates in Muncie. Troy has received travel grants from the Indiana Architectural Foundation, from the College of Architecture and Planning, and he was also the recipient of the William Lefebvre Travel Scholarship in 1988. I've mentioned, I think, that he received a Ball State University undergraduate research grant and also special grants from the Indiana Architecture Foundation and from the College of Architecture and Planning in connection with the exhibit out in the hallway. He will be returning this coming summer for his 3rd season at Sardis as architectural supervisor. I might, as an aside, mention two other Ball State students will be going to Sardis this summer, and they're here this evening as well, Sue Hickey and Monty Antrim. Troy's lecture this evening, Images of Architecture, concerns his experiences at Sardis and the role of architectural drawing on an archaeological expedition. Please welcome, with me, Troy Thompson. This is where I hug him, right? Yeah.
Is that all right? Everybody here? I've been here for a few years, and I've always wondered what it would be like to stand up here and be hugged by someone on the faculty. So I guess now I know. There are a couple people that I would like to mention and give special thanks to that have sort of gone beyond the call of duty in helping get the exhibit and the lecture together. Here in the college, Steve Talley and Bob Givens helped. Well, they didn't help. They did all of the production of the exhibit. They mounted everything, framed it, took care of a lot of slides and a lot of last-minute problems that just kept coming up. They seemed endless, so I would like to thank them. The Sardis office in Cambridge they've spent an incredible amount of hours researching drawings, checking dates, cross-referencing. Everybody in the office was more than willing to help, so I owe a great deal to them. I would like to extend a special thanks to Greenie for taking time out of his busy schedule to come to Muncie and see this. I don't know how the project would have continued and come to completion without the help of Andy. He's been there from the beginning. He introduced me to Sardis and helped me get acquainted the first couple summers before I went, taught me surveying, which it's bad enough to have to learn surveying, let alone teach it to someone. So Andy's been a great help from the beginning, ever since I've been involved with Sardis. And then a couple people who reminded me when I was talking about the different research grants and the process we used to put the exhibit together. And my mom reminded me that, well, when you're thinking of donors, we probably contributed more to this exhibit than any of the foundations and the organizations, and she's probably right. I guess the question that get asked the most concerning Sardis is, what does this have to do with architecture? What does it have to do with philosophy? And why are you interested in it? It's sort of a two-pronged answer. The first being, I was very interested in traveling and seeing Turkey. It's a very interesting place because it's the one part of the world where Western and Eastern cultures meet, and it's a really wonderful mix, and it's very exotic coming from America. So one of my initial motives was just to travel and see the sights and see the classical cities. Another secondary motive has to do with studying philosophy, and one of my favorite periods of philosophy is the pre-Socratics. And Thales and Heraclitus and all these people are from Miletus and Ephesus, which are all within a day's drive of Sardis. So I thought it would be kind of interesting to go walk around the streets of these cities and see where they lived. Those were sort of the first ideas that got me involved. And then once I got there, a lot of things started to change. And the site and being in Turkey and traveling really started to influence me in ways that I hadn't anticipated. Being involved with the archaeology and the site, it really starts to create a sense that architecture is incredibly important, not necessarily just in the present, but a few thousand years down the road, because when we start digging holes in the earth and trying to understand our past, one of the predominant features is architecture, and there are a lot of other aspects and objects and different items that go along with understanding the past, but the architecture can't be denied. It's always there. And it's something I've started feeling about architecture, that today a lot of people don't think about buildings as having that impact and that power. So that's something that just by being at the site and drawing the ruins has start to become very important to me. It's also been fun to see how buildings fall apart. We spend all of our time doing details and looking at books and taking tech courses and this and that. And even though these are 2,000 or 3,000 year old structures and they're made out of stone walls, it's still interesting to see which doors and which windows would withhold the time. So it really makes you start to look at a wall and a door and a window for what it is, and really think about the impact that has. Another thing, particularly about Sardis, because Sardis is a site where there are many contemporary villages located immediately adjacent to the site, and a number of other sites around Turkey also have contemporary villages, but the juxtaposition of these contemporary farming communities with Roman temples and synagogues and bath gymnasium complexes is really interesting, because we read the history books and you only see the temples and the synagogues and the large structures. And it's really wonderful to realize that the way that people are living today in these same places is really just as powerful and just as important architecturally as the temple may be. And one other sort of observation that isn't directly related to architecture has to do with the different type of lifestyle, because it was really shocking for the first time to walk around the dirt streets of many of the villages in the country in Turkey and start to get a sense of the difference between existence and lifestyle. Because in America, everything seems to be judged and valued according to lifestyle and how you live, but in Turkey, where we work, out in the countryside, their life really is dictated by the seasons and the farming, and where you work on the house when you aren't in the vineyards, and you mend the clothes in the evenings, and they have a really interesting life that's very integral to the seasons and to the earth, and knowing how to use the earth, which was very refreshing, I think. It was great not to see a mall for 3 months. I guess I'll explain just some of the duties that the architects do. Most of the people here have to go through the HABS classes, and some people I know from Ball State have worked for HABS. And the process is somewhat similar, because you go into the field and you do a set of field drawings. Only the archaeological field drawings are drawn to scale on grid paper and then later inked onto the mylar, whereas with HABS it's noted with dimensions. So we go out, we set up our elevations and our grid lines, and we sit down and we draw stone for stone to scale all of these rubble walls. And then from those field sheets we make decisions about what the final drawing should communicate in terms of the information, and that becomes the ink drawing. So often we'll take the same field sheet and it may be involved in 3 or 4 different types of final ink versions, depending on what text it may be used with or what specific part of the structure that it's dealing with. The strangest part about working at the site was learning surveying, which is probably the primary responsibility of the architects. Most archaeological sites go in and they'll overlay a surveying grid over the site, and it varies in scale depending on the area that needs to be covered. And this becomes a primary base grid. And the architects are responsible for locating that grid, installing points, and keeping track of this 3-dimensional grid. And then from that larger site grid, we can go into an individual sector or a structure within the site and install a smaller grid that relates to that larger grid. And so that grid becomes the organization for all of the information discovered at the site, basically. All of the potsherds and all of the coins all have grid references, just like the structures do. So the grid is an incredibly important part of the architectural work. And coming from design studios, it's really frustrating to stand there sometimes behind a transit for 4 or 5 hours looking through this little hole thinking, there are a lot of rocks over there that need to be drawn, and all of a sudden the rocks become really beautiful. I guess if we can turn the lights off, we can go ahead and hit some slides. Is it down here? Got to remember how to do this. Oops. They told me this would happen. Well, this is just one of the first images of Sardis, of the temple. And the first excavations at Sardis started in 1910 with Howard Crosby Butler from Princeton and continued for, I think, 12 years. And their explorations focused primarily on the temple and a lot of the cemetery areas adjacent to the temple and on around the perimeters of the site. So this is one of the first and one of the most romantic images of Sardis. The map on the left just locates Sardis within the Turkish continent, or not the continent, but within Turkey. And it shows some of the cities that are located fairly close to Sardis, like Ephesus and Miletus and Pergamum. Troy is a good days away. Philadelphia. You can see on the left Greece and Athens. And then the map on the right is just a closer view of Sardis, showing the city proper, which is at the crossroads, and the Gygean Lake, and then Ben-Tepe, which is a really interesting aspect of Sardis. Ben-Tepe stands for 1,000 Mounds, which is the royal cemetery where the Lydian kings were buried. And this is just a couple general landscapes from right around Sardis. And in both images, you can see off in the distance the mounds of Ben-Tepe. The summers, the weather isn't all that unlike Indiana. The first summer it was a little bit hot, and last summer it was a little cool, but it generally averages out to be quite a bit like the summers in Indiana. Most of this area, the plain on which Sardis lies on the edge of the plain, and it's all agriculture, and probably the only industry would be some clay tile factories located along the highway. These are just a couple of shots of the villages. The image on the left is the road we walk along to go back and forth from where we live to the sectors. And the slide on the right is one of the villages located west of the Pactolus River. The house on the left is one of my favorite structures in the village for a couple of reasons. I was amazed to go to Turkey and find out that Michael Jackson lives in Sart Mustafa. And this is Michael Jackson's house on the left. There are a couple of radio stations in Izmir that play American music. Michael Jackson gets played a lot, and so there's one of the workmen has learned to mimic Michael Jackson's moves and his sounds. And he doesn't speak English, but he can sing Michael Jackson songs, and this is his house. He entertains us all the time. Another interesting aspect to this house, many of the houses in the village, it's hard to tell how old some of them are. This house is, interestingly enough, built much like many of the Lydian houses were built. Vitruvius talks about Lydian structures being built with a stone foundation and mud brick walls and a thatched roof. And this one now has a tile roof with rocks stacked on top to hold the tiles in place, but it's still similar to the way the Lydians would build houses. And the image across the room is just another photograph of the villages. Okay, this is the compound where we live. There are generally 20 to 25 people who spend almost all of the 3 months of the summer working at Sardis. The compound is located right next to the temple, which is very convenient for our 4th of July party, which takes place in the middle of the temple, and nice evenings. And a closer view of the compound. The compound is completely enclosed with walls, and we have guards because most of the objects and the artifacts that are found stay in the depots in the compound. And any of them that go to museums usually go to the Monastery Museum, which is about an hour from Sardis. And this is a view of within the compound. It's a really wonderful place just to wander around because there's so many fragments just scattered around. And it's kind of a hit and miss. You can walk around and pick them up, and maybe you see a scorpion, maybe you don't. It becomes a game, scorpion roulette. This is the basic architectural work position, I guess, if we can't find a chair. Again, this is just the drawing board doing field drawings. And my first summer there, we thought it would be cute to put turtles in a lot of the sections that we were drawing, because we had a pet turtle that used to come around and we would feed it cherries. And so we left it. We drew the turtles in the drawings, and we thought, well, we'll just see how many people notice these turtles. And nobody noticed, so then we weren't sure if we should point them out. We weren't sure what Greenie would think with turtles showing up on all the Roman walls. So I'm not sure if Greenie's having a seminar here with architects saying, well, I think this rock isn't quite right, or if he's saying, I saw the turtles in the drawing, I want you to draw this wall 500 times without turtles in it. Okay, and here's an aerial photograph taken of the Bath Gymnasium in the upper right corner and the contemporary villages. A couple of the sectors are discernible. The aerial photographs are interesting. They've taken place the last couple of summers, and Will and Ellie Myers from Boston University have a program put together where they've been traveling around many of the sites in Turkey the last couple of summers doing aerial archaeology. And some of the images are fantastic. All right, I mentioned that the primary responsibility of the architects is overlaying the site with this grid, which becomes the basis for all the information. The drawing on the left is the urban alignments plan, but the basic plan without the heavy dark lines on it represents the basic city plan of Sardis with the reference grid on it. You can see the temple at the lower bottom and the Bath Gymnasium up at the center. And this plan has become sort of an alteration of that basic surveying plan. And its basic use is to study somehow the possible morphology or the relationship of the different parts of the cities by extending axes from certain major structures or along certain roads or certain faces of buildings, and maybe be able to derive some type of notion of the organization of the city or orientation of a grid or major streets or something. Okay. One thing I want to mention, since I'm not an archaeologist and I'm not a classicist, there are a lot of times where we might want to know more about the Lydians or more about the Romans. But I'm really going to focus just on the drawings and the specific uses of drawings and try not to get into the history. It's an area that I'm probably not the one to be talking about it. So the slide on the left is the Bath Gymnasium before Reconstruction. And the Bath Gymnasium is a very unique structure. It was the first major reconstruction in Turkey. And it's also unique because there aren't a lot of examples of Bath Gymnasium combinations, and especially Bath Gymnasium combinations with a synagogue. In the plan on the right, the lower long rectangular space later became used as a synagogue, and it's the largest synagogue known in the classical world at this point. And also on this map, we start to get a sense of the way the excavations move through the site, because a lot of times it may appear ordered and actually be disordered or vice versa. And we can see fragments of the many different buildings in different sectors being explored in the lower part of the plan. Okay, once the grid and a lot of the surveying has taken place and excavations are underway, the next thing the architects do is they go in and they start documenting individual features, and usually architectural features. And the type of graphics and the type of drawing that's used varies quite often according to the information that needs to be communicated. And this is a more atypical type of drawing, and it's just a stipple drawing of one of the pediment ends with a photograph of the other end on the left. And the reason this drawing was done with stipples is the stippling really captures the texture and the broken areas and the condition of the stone. And it's also very good for illustrating the type of detail in the ornamental carvings. Also involved with the reconstruction of the Bath Gymnasium project was a lot of research to other sites around Turkey. The slide on the left is the library at Ephesus, and they began reconstruction on it after the Bath Gymnasium. But when the architects and archaeologists started going into research about the Bath Gymnasium, they looked at many sites around Western Turkey as well as other structures of similar architectural detail all around the classical period, or classical world. The library at Ephesus is very similar to the Bath Gymnasium, and they did look at the Bath Gymnasium when they started reconstruction on this. So it's a matter of going in first and initially documenting the materials on site, and then going into a different mode of research, which involves other sites and other structures that may be related somehow. The drawing on the right has a couple of the entablature stones of the Bath Gymnasium with inscriptions, and the inscriptions are very often keys to some of the chronology of the structures. So a couple of the inscriptions of the Bath Gymnasium spoke of dates and donors who contributed to the construction of the Bath Gymnasium, so it was possible to start to put together some type of history for that structure from the inscriptions. And the drawing on the right is just a line drawing dealing more with the inscriptional information and not so much with the condition of the fragment itself. As I mentioned, it's important to go in and initially document the material that's found within a certain area or relating to a certain building. The drawing on the left documents in white the fragments of the columns and the architectural orders that were found, and then the hatched areas are a possible infill for a reconstruction of the entire ordering system. The drawing on the right is just a further developed version dealing with the two orders and getting much more into the egg and dart patterns and the different types of moldings. The drawing on the right starts to do a combination of things. It relates to the earlier image we saw that delineates between existing material and material that needs to be recreated. This drawing starts to look at proportioning systems used by other Roman orders of the same type or proportioning systems on buildings of a similar scale, and starts to put that information together with the fabric and the columns that were found at Sardis. And then the image on the right is just the reconstruction. And have a few images here of the Bath Gym during reconstruction. One of the interesting aspects to the reconstruction, we were up on a hill away from the site one day and looking back down, and it's really curious because this is such a large reconstruction in a very large space, but we'll see later in a couple drawings, it looks like it's the big solid part of the building, but in fact it was actually a void within the entire Bath Gymnasium complex. And on the left is the finished version of the reconstruction. The drawing on the right is one of the study perspectives used during reconstruction. These drawings were done after the physical reconstruction of the Bath Gymnasium had taken place. And so often, most of the archaeological drawings will go through a number of changes and developments. And these are just two different versions of a similar type of drawing. The one on the left being the older and the one on the right being the latest version of the reconstruction of the entire complex. In these drawings, the synagogue is the lower rectangular space on the left. Another axonometric studying the barrel vaulting and the structures of the bath part of the complex around the marble court. And on the right, again, the finished reconstruction, or nearly finished. As I mentioned before, the synagogue is a very interesting structure because it's the largest synagogue of the classical world at this point. And initially, the space was some type of large basilican space, but later became used as a synagogue. The drawing or the photograph on the left is just a photograph during Reconstruction. On the right is a model that wasn't used particularly for the Reconstruction, but it's interesting because models are something that could be used in archaeology to study reconstructions just as well as different types of drawings. And sometimes that's the case. This one was done for a museum later, I guess. Another interesting part of the synagogue has to do with the scale. And on the left, the Sardis synagogue is at the top, and at the bottom are a number of other synagogues found within the classical world. Number 2 is from Priene, and the other ones, there are a couple more scattered around Turkey, and then other ones throughout the Mediterranean. The slide on the right shows the Sardis synagogue, which is down on the bottom right-hand corner, in comparison to some of the synagogues from Roman Palestine of the same period. And from comparisons like this, we really begin to see what the difference in scale was. These are some of the state plans from the excavations of the synagogue. These have been cleaned up and redrawn from older field sheets, but they're good examples of what a state plan would look like from many of the sectors. The state plans are the plans or sections or elevations that are drawn at the end of an excavation season or possibly on and off during excavations, which document the features in the context that they were found. They denote things like construction and variation of stone size, any type of flooring or ground covering, and the field sheets for these drawings contain all of the information that was found. They're the true record document. And most of the inkings, again, are used for publications and may not contain all of the information that is on the field sheets. This is just a line drawing of the mosaic that was found in the apse at the end of the synagogue structure. We can see the photograph on the left that many areas were missing, and on the drawing on the right, they've been filled in. And another aspect of architecture work, which involves research and comparative studies, but it also involves documentation of very small features on the site. The drawing on the left is a study of the valve for the fountain in the forecourt of the synagogue. And just like working in an office or doing a design project, these drawings start out as sketches and then they gradually become more and more refined, and everybody puts notes on them and everybody erases on them, and finally we start to get close to something like the drawing on the right, which is a nearly complete ink version minus some of the notes and letters and a few little details. These are some studies of different sections of the synagogue. The study on the left is an old blueprint that's just been scribbled on with pencil, trying to get a notion of some of the forms and the spaces and the relationship of the forecourt in front of the synagogue and the colonnade going around the large space in front of the bath gymnasium. And then there's a smaller version, a quick little thumbnail sketch along the bottom. And many times when dealing with the reconstruction, there's so much information coming in different ways and from different sources that it is very much like a design project. Once the architect or the archaeologists get to this stage, it becomes a matter of working going all the way down to the detail and the column size to the entire section of the structure and seeing how it relates to the larger context. These are a couple studies for a perspective of the interior of the synagogue. The first one is just a very quick sketch, and then the right, it becomes more defined and more constructed. And it's literally just a sketch to study the different types of hatching that could be used on the drawing and where they could be used. And then a later version of a study sketch. And then the image on the right is the latest interior perspective of the synagogue. And a photograph of the forecourt. It's nearly reconstructed. The image on the right was one of the curious features at Sardis that really struck me when I first arrived. And we can see part of the wall just past the forecourt on the synagogue here. But it was really interesting to see the relationship between Roman construction and structures and then the ornamental system that was just applied over that. I'd seen this in books and at some other sites in Europe, but it's really interesting that on one hand there's the structural order and the structural system and the structural materials that forms the building and then go in and decorate it, which isn't at all unlike what happens today in most cases. Okay, these two slides are both of Pactolus North, and these are good slides to get an idea of what the topography and the terrain is like in many of the excavation trenches. There are almost an infinite number of heights and features scattered around that may initially appear as 2 or 3 stones, but when they've been cleaned up and when they've been drawn in plan, in context of 2 or 3 stones over here and 2 or 3 stones over here, they begin to look like a wall, or they begin to define a corner or some type of structure. One of the things about the final ink drawings that we see in the exhibit, many of them seem very sterile and almost abstract when seen in this context, because all of the textures and the materials seem to disappear. So it's nice to see where they came from. The image on the left is one of the late churches from the PN area, and the big glob of brick in the center is a dome that's fallen upside down in place. It's just sort of tipped over. And the drawing on the right is a plan of that same area with the dome removed, so in order to see the plan more clearly. The drawing on the right also starts to delineate walls that have been removed during excavations, as well as walls that may have been reconstructed after excavations. Often, the only way to completely understand a certain area or a certain structure is to remove part of that structure. And oftentimes, it's important to note when that happens. An aerial photograph of the same area on the left. And then the drawing on the right starts to get into a different type of documentation. Many of the perspectives and axons that we saw associated with the bath gym and the synagogue they were reconstruction and almost process drawings. They weren't actual documentation drawings. The drawing on the right is an axonometric that documents exactly what was there. And another interesting thing about this drawing is it starts to combine different features from different periods. So on the drawing on the right, there are Lydian features and some Hellenistic features and late Roman and early Byzantine structures, all in the same drawing. These are 2 slides of the temple. The one on the left is not too long after sunset, and the one on the right is getting close to or the one on the left is sunrise and the one on the right is sunset. I'm looking at them backwards. The temple is our little haven from the compound. Everyone goes off before cocktails and they sit in the temple, and everyone goes out at night and watches the stars and have the 4th of July party. And some people go out and burn incense, and we think the temple's on fire. But like I mentioned, the temple was one of the first features excavated at Sardis. And it's become another hot area, I guess, because one of the architects is beginning a documentation project, and he's comprehensively going through and drawing every single stone and tool marking on the temple. They're really beautiful drawings. The temple at Sardis is one of the 7 largest temples in the world, and it's really hard to get a feel for the scale of this thing without being there. The plan on the left is one of the original Butler plans, and at best we think this was 1912, and it's still a very integral drawing. All of the plans from the Butler excavations are still important and are still maintained because of the information they contain. The photograph on the right is an aerial of the temple. The state plan on the left, if we look just at the temple, we can see the dark areas at the end of the temple structure itself are exactly the same as the dark areas that were delineated on the Butler plan. And so much of that information came from the original drawings and were confirmed. But the other thing that's interesting, the Artemis Temple is located outside of the city walls. So this drawing starts to document the entire temple precinct and put together some type of order and understanding of what the structures were around the temple. And on the right is a Reconstruction perspective of the temple as it might have been in late Roman times, with the late Roman toga party in front. The drawing on the left is a combination drawing and photograph. And again, like the axonometrics and the perspectives that we see, it's an interesting way of putting the fragments into a context that may not be completely described by a drawing, and it may not be possible to show the information in a photograph. So it's just another technique of trying to use the information in a way that can be better communicated. And the drawing on the right, or the slide on the right, I put in because I've been tormented by this story about Sardis ever since I arrived. About the 2nd or 3rd day, someone said, well, Troy, you've got to go out and look and find the lizard that's carved on the column base. And I thought it was a wild goose chase, so I just sort of ignored it. And then after time, people would say, well, have you found the lizard? Have you found the lizard? And finally, I started sneaking out before cocktails and looking for this lizard, but I didn't want to tell anyone that I was looking. I thought they were still pulling my leg. And Andy, if they're pulling my leg, he started pulling it this week because he says it's really there, but I haven't found it yet. Okay, now we move up to Bizfort. And with these slides, we begin to get into the more active parts of the site. Many of the sectors, the temple and the Bath Gymnasium, the synagogue, are all older sectors of the site. There are 2 or 3 areas that are under intense excavation now, and Bizfort is beginning to pick up. Bizfort stands for Byzantine Fortress, and we've come to find that most of the material is not Byzantine, and it doesn't seem to be a fortress, but we still call it Bizfort anyway. The structure that we see here is some late Roman structure, and it doesn't seem to be very well understood at this point. But the really curious aspect of Bizfort has to do with the relationship between Lydian, Hellenistic, and Roman features. It's located on a finger of land that comes down out of the Acropolis, sort of a spur, and you can see from the slides that it's fairly high above the plain. And it's a fairly thin hill as well. So these are a couple earlier excavation shots of the site. In the photograph on the right, there are the two long walls running parallel down the center. As they get to the far perpendicular wall, there's an L-shaped wall that sticks off to the left. That's a Hellenistic wall, and all of the other material shown above is Roman. And we can just barely see a couple Lydian features in this lower room on the far right, not very well. And that becomes important when we start to look at the plans. Does this pointer work, Andy? Let's do this. Oh, there we go. Okay, like I mentioned, the main structure is a late Roman structure. There is a Lydian feature right here and some other smaller stones scattered around this feature that are Lydian. This is the Hellenistic wall that we just saw. And then this whole edge of the hill around the building slopes very steeply, steep enough that you can't comfortably walk down it. And then there's an entire corner here that's been excavated that has late Roman and early Byzantine structures. And there's a dark area here which represents a roof covering the Lydian terrace wall. And another corner of the terrace wall has been found here. So the plan over here deals only with Lydian features, so it filters out all of the Roman and Hellenistic and Byzantine features just to focus on the Lydian features and try to get some type of understanding of how they go together and what they mean. This is the corner of the large Lydian terrace wall, which seems to follow the topography of the hill. And these are the scattered Roman features that we can see in the photograph. The past summer, the archaeologists dug this entire rectangle down to the bedrock surface, went through all of the periods of habitation until he reached bedrock. And what he found carved into the bedrock were all of these pits and holes, many of them fairly square with corners for posts or something, other ones fairly circular. So this plan even goes beyond documenting the rocks and the architectural features and gets to the voids that were cut into the earth to see how they affected the architecture. The section on the left is cut through the front of the hill, looking back into that Roman structure. And here we can see the terrace wall and the corner over here. And this is a Lydian wall. And in section, we also documented the cutting of the bedrock to try to understand how the growth and the construction on the hill took place. So the bedrock has been cut along the heavy lines, which follows the Lydian construction. And then up at the top of the hill, the bedrock has also been cut in a really strange manner. The drawing on the right is just an enlarged version of the terrace wall. One of the archaeologists has been working on Lydian masonry techniques, and he drew this himself, illustrating all of the put-log holes and some of the notches that were used to scoot the stones around and fit them tightly in place. And he also drew it at a large enough scale that he can really pick up the different tool marks and the dressing of all of the stones. So it's a really interesting drawing. It has an incredible amount of information in it. I can't even begin to understand a lot of it, but Chris can look at it and knows what every line means. Okay, now we move to MMS, which is the monumental mud brick structure sector. The plan on the left illustrates, oh, is that upside down? Yeah. Can we turn that over? Is that? Oh, and now sideways. Let's put the top piece on the left-hand side. Is that okay? This one, right over here. This is a really great drawing. We have to... Can we put this on the left? Like turn it sideways? Okay. This is the monumental mud brick structure. This is the Roman state plan, late Roman habitations level. And this drawing has been updated almost every year during the 80s. Each year, maybe a small 5 or 10 square meter area may be added to it. I bet there are probably over 40 individual field sheets that have to be combined to create this drawing, and they span 10 or 12 years. 2 years ago, my first summer, our supervisor undertook redrawing this plan to try to update it and spent a great deal of the summer with it. But anyway, what the plan shows is all of the Roman habitation levels of the late Roman period. And most of the slides on the right begin to show the way many of the trenches are scattered apart and not immediately next to one another. And that's the way this plan developed, was from trenches scattered in different areas over the site. So it was quite a task to keep this drawing in registration and organized. I can show this is just one of the rooms with a fountain in the end wall. And it's located right in here with the fountain on this end, just to get an idea of what the drawing represents. This has been a very interesting trench, and I'm looking at this backwards. I got to see where it is. Well, it's located a little bit off of this drawing. Yeah. Well, in this trench, we have the main Roman wall, which is the back side of a sidewalk for a long colonnaded street. We can see columns peeking up that run along the edge of the street. This trench is a good example of what happens when we dig a hole in the ground and find both Lydian and Roman features right next to one another. And oftentimes it's important to eventually remove some of the Roman in order to understand the Roman and then understand the Lydian features later. This is part of a large Lydian limestone wall that eventually last summer, all of this area was cleaned out, and we traced this wall up and around and over and right underneath the Roman road. So many areas of this drawing, this large room and a few areas over in here, have been removed just as these Roman walls in order to understand the Lydian features. This is one of the infamous turtle sections. It's the only one that doesn't have a turtle in it because there were no floors in the trench, so we couldn't put a turtle in it. This is just a section through some of the Roman structure. The slide on the right is the apse, which is located on the left, and we can see the wall paintings and some of the plaster work that shows up in the drawings. Also on the walls, even without drawing floor lines on this image, we can start to pick up floor lines that run along mortar beds where there was revetment at the floors and other areas where there may have been floors. Okay, now we get to a really complicated area of Sardis. This is the Roman state, or the Lydian state plan, that coincides to the Roman plan we just saw. All of the information on this drawing or the information within this rectangle is contained within the Roman plan that we were just looking at. The drawing on the right is a drawing from 1982, when it was still possible to include Roman and Lydian features on the same plan. We can see very lightly the outline of some of the Roman walls. And up here there are a few. And all of this darker area represents some type of Lydian feature, Lydian structure. And in this area, it required going through the Roman floor and removing part of the walls to find the Lydian feature. That corner of the limestone wall is right here. On the drawing on the right, the slide didn't work out so well, but we have the different screens that start to show the different materials. We have the stone represented as stone. Then we have different screens that represent mud brick structure and mud brick debris and sloping layers and different types of information. This is a photograph of the mud brick structure. It's, I guess in all, it was probably somewhere between 45 and 60 feet tall. Nearly all of the structure that we found sits on some type of stone base and then generally picks up with a sloping mud brick face. And later at some point there was a limestone structure built within the center of that wall. This is just a slide showing the mud brick. It's very unique, I guess, to find mud brick structures this far west in Turkey and to find them in this good a shape, because in some areas the structure seems to be only a few feet below the surface, and it's still in fairly good condition. Here's another photograph of the mud brick structure, and the photograph is taken from here looking this way. So we can see how abstract the plan can be and how much in terms of the materials and the textures can really be lost. But it really does contain a lot of information when looked at with in conjunction with the photographs. The mud brick structure changes from time to time from a mud brick wall to a limestone wall. This is a corner of one of the limestone walls, which is located at this point. And since there is so much Roman overbuild, it's hard to go in and just excavate all of these unknown areas and find other areas that may be gaps. So it becomes guesswork, because here we have one corner that's a limestone wall, and here we have another corner that's a mud brick wall. And what might that connection be? Or in some cases, it's even worse, where there's a highway running through the site. We have Lydian walls up here and another type of Lydian structure at this side, and there's no way of putting together any type of understanding. It's where the grid also comes in handy, because we can set the grid over the whole site and not have to tape measure across the road and run back across the road. This is another view of one of these small trenches. There are a number of these small exploration trenches that, this is a meter wide, I think that stick's a meter wide, and many of these trenches get very deep. This one, I think, got down to 25 or 30 feet deep. It was almost impossible to plumb bob it, to draw it. These are a couple early sketches trying to get an understanding of what the mud brick structure may have looked like. The drawing on the left is just a bird's eye view of what the capital of Lydia may have looked like with part of the structure in place. The drawing on the right is just a quick sketch of possible construction. This is one of my favorite drawings from all of the Sardis drawings. It's drawn to scale, and it's the one drawing that gives us an understanding and a sense of the whole colossal Lydian structure and the mud brick structure in this area. This is the mud brick facing on the wall, or the mud brick wall on both sides. This is the limestone corner that we saw. This is the other corner below the mud brick. But the drawing starts to put the Lydian in a context relating it to the Roman. We see very lightly outlined some of the Roman structures that have been cut in and built upon the Lydian structure. And at this point, we see a couple spaces from some type of Lydian domestic area. And another strange feature with the mud brick structure has to do with these sloping layers that have somehow been built up next to the mud brick walls. And that's something that doesn't show up in plan. And if we were to cut a section through here, much of this other information would have been lost. So this sort of perspective drawing really puts us at a point of view where we can see it from many different angles. And this area right here is just a plane, just a section cut showing this mud brick fall. And another aspect of the colossal Lydian structure has to do with some type of destruction, whereby a lot of the mud brick came tumbling down on both sides. And we generally date that with the fall of the Lydian capital in 547 BC, but it's still not completely understood which side is the city side of, if it's a fortification wall, which side is the city side, which side is outside, because this occurs on both sides. This is the Lydian building reconstruction, and Sardis is the only site currently under excavation that deals with Lydian occupation. And there were a number of Lydian houses in Pactolus North, and there were gold refineries. And Sardis was the first place to issue coins. So there's been quite a bit of Lydian material found at Sardis. So this is a later reconstruction of a Lydian building. The drawing on the left is just a section / elevation, and then a photograph of the building at Sardis on the right. And I just found out today when I was speaking with Greenie, I always wondered why it was only this wide. And again, it has to do with, in archaeology and in this type of research, you can only go as far as your information will allow you. And he was explaining that certain areas in the ridge and some of the decorative ornament couldn't be very solidly understood or defined, so they had to stop it at a point at which they were certain and not go beyond that. Final reports. Let's have some coffee.
Yeah, I think. Would you please join Troy and all our other guests for the, I guess, official opening of the exhibit across the hall. We welcome you to look at the exhibit. There will be refreshments served, and I think we have some, if you don't know what the sweet, sticky stuff is, it's a traditional Turkish pastry called baklava. Please join us. Thank you.